Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to episode 54 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the EXS24, which is a sampler included with Logic 10. The EXS24 that we have in Logic 9 and 10 is the Mark II version of the EXS24. There was a Mark I version in earlier versions of Logic, I think back in Logic 7 and 6, maybe even earlier than that. Before we go into how to use the sampler, what I want to talk about first is proper sample management, because if you don't manage your samples, you don't manage your sample files properly, you're going to end up with instruments that when you open them up for the second time or the third time or later in the future, they don't work because you've kind of misappropriated your samples. So what I'm going to do real quick is just minimize logic. What I do with my samples is I keep them on a secondary hard drive. I have this second hard drive installed in my computer. It's the Macintosh HD is the one I'm booting my operating system off of and all my apps. The media drive is the one I keep files and sessions and things like that on. You don't have to have two different drives. Just find a central location for your samples, make a samples folder there, and don't move it. Just leave it there. Never move it, because if you move your samples, then your sampler instruments aren't going to work anymore. So I save mine under my media drive under an audio folder, and then I have a folder labeled ZZZ sample library. I only put the Z's there just so it appears at the bottom of the list. So in my sample library, I've got my samples kind of organized by, by just kind of what instrument they are, by type. The ones that we're going to look at first are right here. And by the way, each instrument I also categorize. So each one of these could be built as a different instrument. So I'm going to open up this one here called Chorus Sawtooth. And you'll see that they are organized and named by their pitch. You want to make sure that you name your sample files in one of two ways. One like this, alphabetically. So basically like A#1, so like the pitch, the accidental, whether it's sharp or flat, and then the octave identification. The other thing is you can't really use flats when you name sample files, because if I just said A lowercase b1, the sampler is going to be confused as to what pitch it's trying to figure out where to put this. If you say A#1, it knows that the pound sign is a sharp. So if you have a sample that's on, say, E flat, go with the enharmonic note of D sharp as opposed to E flat. So I always use sharps when naming my samples as opposed to flats. So if I go down the list, you can see basically we've got C, D, E, F, G all the way up alphabetically. There's 5 octaves of each, and I'm only using sharps, no flats. If you don't name your samples that way, the other way to name them would be to name them like this, just numerically, and numerically in chromatic order. So, O1 could be like C1, O2 could be C#1, O3 could be D1, so forth, going all the way up to chromatic scale. Unless you're working with just like loops or like drum samples, like if you're working with instruments that are kind of tonal instruments, this is pretty much the way you want to name your samples, because the EXS24 sampler and many other samplers out there in the market have the ability to auto-map samples. So that's what I'm going to show you today, is just to kind of how to get started using the EXS24's auto-map feature. So let me get Logic back up here. Another thing I'm going to do is let me save real quick. And when you go to save or save as for the first time, if you're working with the EXS24, most of the time you want to make sure you check this EXS instruments and samples checkbox. If you're working with Ultrabeat, you can do the same with Ultrabeat. What this does is it stores a copy of the EXS24 instruments and samples from your sample library in the project folder. Now, you don't have to do this. If you only work on your computer at home, then there's no need to check this, because EXS24 is going to reference the instruments and samples that we create from that folder, at least the samples from that folder that I have. Mine's labeled sample library. The EXS24 also automatically saves all of the instruments you create and another folder in Logic's sort of media library, if you will. So if you only work on one computer at home, there's no need to check this box. If you take your session around from computer to computer, then you definitely want to make sure you check this box, because again, it saves a copy of all of your instruments you've created and all your samples in your project folder. And if you try to take a session to another computer, and that computer doesn't have your instrument that you've made or your samples that you have on your computer, then your instrument's not going to work. So sorry for that long introduction about sample management, but it's necessary, because I can tell you right now, a lot of people will have this problem if you don't follow these just basic rules of sample file management. Okay, so let's get the EXS24 up and running. Just go to my instrument tab here. Let's choose the EXS24. And like Ultrabeat, there's kind of multiple modes you can load it in. It has multi-output mode. You can also load it in surround sound. We're just going to use stereo. Here's our EXS24. And the main window here is basically your main sort of synthesis and modulation window. It's only going to really do anything if you have samples loaded into it, which we don't have any samples loaded right now. But you will notice a lot of these controls look very similar to the S2 that we looked at before. There's a filter, there's some pitch controls, volume controls, there's some modulation routers, LFOs, and envelopes. We're not going to mess with those too much right now because, well, we're just building our first instrument. So the window that we want to open up is called the edit window, and you can get to it by clicking right here. But one thing you want to maybe double check before you get into the edit window is go to your options and go to the preferences in the options and make sure that the read root key from file option here is on file name file. I've just found that with that selected, the EXS24 properly auto maps more correctly. So I'm going to click on the edit window. And this is the edit window. This is where you can load in all of your samples. Now, yes, you can drag and drop a sample right in here and then move it wherever you want on the keyboard. But just to make it easy for ourselves today, we're going to use the Automap feature, which automatically puts all of the samples in your sample library in the correct place on the keyboard, and that's what we want. So to Automap, you go up to this menu, or this menu option that says Zone, and you go to Load Multiple Samples, or you can use the key command, Control O rather. Click on that, and then what you do is you go find your sample library. So mine's on my media drive, under Audio, and under my sample library. And then I'm just going to go to Synths. And the first one we looked at was called Chorus Sawtooth. So I'm going to click on that. Click over here in the window. And then all you have to do now is you can just hit Add All, and it'll add all of the samples for that instrument into this little loading window. If you want to kind of audition them, you can click on them and hit play. And it should play it, except it's not playing it. I'm not sure why. Then you hit Done down here. And this menu will pop up. This is the Automap menu, or the Automap window. So it says, adding 61 samples, please choose how to build the map. So we are going to map these samples to particular zones or keys on our MIDI controller. So for when you have your samples named this way, where you have the pitch name, the accidental, the sharp if needed, and then the octave identification, you're going to want to use the Automap option. And what that does is it reads the root key from the name of the file and places it on the correct key. So that first sample that was named C1 will automatically map to the key C1, and C#1 and D1 and so forth all the way up the keyboard. So we just choose Automap and then hit OK. And as you can see, it's placed one sample per key all the way up the keyboard. Now, if you're working with an instrument where you'd only have like every other note on the keyboard, like C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, but not, the notes in between, it'll actually automatically extrapolate the pitches in between the samples that you have. So you don't actually have to sample every single note from an instrument to build a full instrument like this. It'll, like I said, it'll extrapolate the pitches in between, and I'll show you that just in a moment. But let's double check just to make sure everything works. Basically, this view down here is just sort of like an interface, a GUI view, just sort of like a more visual view of what's going on. The list up here is essentially just a list view of everything that's going on. So you can see all of our samples, all the sample names. The pitch key column is where it's mapped the root tuning to. And then the key range is physically where the sample is located on the keyboard. So everything should match up. A#1 has a root key of A#1, and it's located on A#1. So that's what we want. So let me just play this, and let's see if this works. I don't have my MIDI controller hooked up, so I'm just going to open up my musical typing keyboard by pressing Command K. Yeah, and that sounds terrible, but it works. Let me bump up the octave I'm in here. There we go. So we have a working multi-sampled instrument. Now, after you load in your samples, and maybe you want to go back to the modulation window here and tweak a few things, add a filter cutoff to it, or maybe some effects to it. What's going to happen is when you close out this window, it's automatically going to ask you, do you want to save the changes that you've made to this instrument? And you always want to say yes, because if you say don't save, we're going to lose all this sample loading that we just did. So I'm going to hit save, and then give this a name. I'm just going to call it Chorus Sawtooth, because that's the name of the samples that I loaded in. Now, if you checked that checkbox I showed you in the Save As dialog, it's going to save this to... Actually, it looks like it already does. Music Logic EXS24 sample instruments. But it should also make a copy of it. Actually, no, the name of my folder was EXS24. So yeah, if you check that, it's going to save it inside your session folder, inside another folder called Sampler Instruments. If you didn't check it, it's actually going to save it to a different location on your computer's hard drive where all of your sample instruments are located on your hard drive. So it's up to you which way you do it. I like checking the box just to kind of guarantee that it works. So I'll hit save. There we go. And now I can kind of tweak this any way I want out here to kind of alter the instrument. I can hit R or arm it for recording, hit R to record, and I can record this instrument. So I'm going to set that one aside. I'm just going to call it Chorus Sawtooth. And I'm going to build another instrument just to show you that you can indeed extrapolate notes in between pitches. And pay no attention to me adding this send here. It's just so that you can hear this instrument in the screen capture. So I'm going to go ahead and load another EXS24 here in stereo. Go back to the edit window. Zone, load multiple samples, just like we did before. And this time, there's an instrument, and I have that I know that not all of the, I don't have the full chromatic scale sampled. So let me just go in here. Since I think it's the one, trance bass, here it is. I have C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, and then G1 through 4. So basically I have a pretty wide gap between all of my samples. So let's go ahead and add all. Again, because they're named properly, I'm just going to choose the Automap feature, hit OK. And as you can see, it has automatically extrapolated the pitches in between the keys. So my sample, C2 has a center tuning, a root tuning of C2, but the actual key range for it is wider than C2. It goes from A#1 to D#2. And if you click on a sample up here, you'll see where that sample is located. So when I play C2, I hear C2, but it also will uptune or downtune that sample so I don't have, so it basically fills in the gaps between the samples. so we don't lose any samples or any sounds in between the keys, and I have a playable instrument again. All right, so let me just close this one out and save it. I'll call it trance bass. There we go. Close that out. And let's build one more instrument, and then I'll show you just a little musical example that I've built with this. So let me just kind of minimize these. Call this trance bass. And let me build one more. For this instrument, I want to use that other set of samples where they were just labeled 1 through 64 or whatever. So zone, load multiple samples again. This instrument was located under, it was called buzzy strings, I think. Buzzy strings, there we go. So these ones are just labeled 01 through whatever, and I just happen to know that the very first note, 01, is C1. So I'm going to add all of these, hit done. And we can't use Automap here because Automap, as we said before, looks for the root key of the name of the file. We have to use, instead for this, a feature called contiguous zones, which basically starts on sample 1 and builds the map chromatically or with a set zone width. What I happen to know offhand is that set of samples starts on C1, and then I have every single note going chromatically up. So the sample that was labeled 01 is C1, 02 is C sharp 1, and so forth all the way up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say zone width 1 note because it's chromatically. If you had every other note, you'd choose 2 notes. Zone width or zone start note is C1 because that's where the first sample is. So I'll just hit OK. As you can see, it's built the map up chromatically. Now in the previous mode, in the Automap mode, it actually took our lowest note and our highest note and kind of stretched them all the way down and all the way up. And you can do that yourself just by hovering over the right side of the sample here and pulling it all the way up or pulling it all the way down. So now I have notes across the entire keyboard. The only tricky thing with contiguous zones is that it automatically turns on this one-shot option, which is good for drums because it plays the whole sample regardless of how long you hold the key down. For this instrument, since it's just like a synth patch, we don't need that on, because otherwise if I hit a key on my keyboard, well, you probably can't hear that very well because it's I haven't set up my send here. Let me pull that in there. Let's try that again. So if I hit a key, I'm not holding the key down right now. I just played the key once and it's playing that whole sample. So that's what the one-shot option does. It's good, again, good for drums, not good for synths like this. So I'm just going to hit Command A to select everything in here and uncheck one-shot. Close the window out, hit save, and I'll call this one Buzzy Strings. And close that out. And then I'll also rename this Buzzy Strings. Okay, so I've built 3 sort of synth instruments. One's a bass, one's sort of a lead, and one's a string instrument. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the video for just a moment, tweak a few things, come up with a basic musical example, and I'll be right back and I'll show you what I did. All right, I'm back, and what I did was I just composed a basic sort of 16-bar idea here. It's basically just a 4-bar loop that I looped 4 times. I've got my 3 EXS instruments that I built. I just put nice little icons on them, and I just added just a stock ultra beat pattern in there. So let's see what this sounds like. All right, so it's might be a nice little idea to start off a new song, but the instruments are kind of bland, because they're basically just using the samples as is. We're not, we're not tweaked them at all. There's no effects on them. We haven't processed them in the instrument at all. So let me just show you a few little things you can do to kind of tweak these instruments a bit. Let's start with the chorus sawtooth by itself. By itself, it sounds like this. Very dry. It's a polyphonic instrument as well. Oftentimes, I'll make my leads legato. For this reason, let me just open this up in Piano Roll. On purpose, I kind of made all of the notes overlap each other a bit, because if I make this legato and then pull up the glide, I can get a little bit of sort of like pitch drift or glide between the notes. So that's what I want to do, and that's why I've left it that way. And in polyphonic mode, that really doesn't do anything for us because we can have multiple notes playing at the same time. So what I'm going to do is turn legato on. So the envelopes between notes aren't there anymore. It's a little softer, but what I really want to do is pull up this glide feature just a bit to give it a little bit of sort of a drift between notes. So the other thing I did is down here, envelope number 2 controls the volume, the output volume of the synthesizer. So I just pulled the attack time up a bit just to soften the front end of each note, and I pulled up the release time a bit so each note doesn't just immediately cut off. There's a little bit of a sort of a little decay in the way it kind of releases. So I'm also going to get rid of this modulation here. By default, the EXS24 turns on or automatically has a modulation router set up for vibrato pitch being controlled by an LFO via control number 1, which is the modulation wheel. I don't want that, so I'm just going to option click on it. The sample select velocity, we'll talk about that later. We can leave it alone for now. It's not really going to matter whether or not we turn it on or off. And another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add like a high pass filter to this. This is the filter module, has all the same controls we've seen before. Filter cutoff frequency, resonance, drive, like sort of a drive unit. Don't worry about the key tracking mode yet. We'll talk about that another time. So I'm just going to turn the filter on, pull the cutoff down a bit, and you try a high pass filter. There we go. Before. After. Remember, a high pass filter cuts out the lows, whereas a low pass would cut out the highs. All right, so we've got that kind of the way we want it. Let's move to the next instrument, the buzzy strings here. You can hear there's a little bit of a gap between each chord. So what I'm going to do with the, make sure I open up the right instrument. There we go. What I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to pull up the release time significantly. So it allows the tail end of the chords to linger a bit. The other thing I'm going to do with this is I want to create sort of like a stutter effect with it, like almost like a stutter effect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my destination or target, as we learned in the ES2. I'm going to set that to volume. And then I'm going to get rid of the via, except I have to choose a source first. The source I'm going to make LFO number 2. All 3 LFOs in the EXS24 can be synchronized to hertz or to the beat clock, kind of like we just discussed in the ES2 video. So you can synchronize them to the rate of your tempo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make LFO2 control volume at a 1/8 notes pace. So just pull this down until it says 1/8 note. And I'm going to choose, I'll start with triangle wave. We'll see what that sounds like, and pull the amount up a bit. Let's see what that sounds like. So we get sort of a pulsing effect. All right, that's all I want to do with that. Let's go to the bass now. The sample itself already has sort of a filter sweep in it, but I'm going to try to give it sort of like a wobbly effect. So my destination, I'm going to turn on the filter, use a low-pass filter, pull it down a bit. I'm going to turn the fat button on, which basically just adds sort of like a low-frequency boost, almost like a low-frequency shelf, which can kind of boost the low frequencies, which we'd want to do with a bass. And I'm going to make the destination the filter cutoff. So it's going to control this cutoff knob. And then I'm going to make the source LFO2. Get rid of the via parameter there. And let me try this at an eighth note as well. Actually, let's try a quarter note first. Pull the amount up a bit. Let's try a different shape. So that's with the sawtooth there. I could do a reverse sawtooth and... Whoops. For a reverse sawtooth, I'm going to need to pull this up, I think. Or down, actually. I'm going to pull up the drive knob as well, just to give it a little bigger sound. Let's see what all those sound like together. Okay, the bass sounds cool. It just, I don't know, just sounds more distracting than anything to me. So let me try the forward-facing sawtooth. Let me just solo that again. Yeah, I like that more than the kind of the one that's on the offbeat. All right, let's pull everything in there. Just threw a little delay on the sawtooth, just some compression and a reverb on the strings. And maybe just a little EQ on the bass. Maybe make it sound a little more subby sounding. All right, let me play this whole thing one more time, and then we'll be done. Here we go. So we've got a pretty nice start to a new track. The thing I really love about sampling in this way, as opposed to just relying on the Ultrabeat or relying on buying more synths or using presets, is it lets you kind of build an instrument from the ground up. So you can truly say, this is an instrument that no one else has. This is an instrument, that other people might have the samples to, but this is an instrument I designed myself. I tweaked and synthesized myself, and although yes, there's similar instruments out there, it's something that I did myself. So to me, it's something that's more creative than simply opening up a preset and turning a couple knobs. Here, you're building the preset and then turning a few knobs. So, a lot of people are probably going to ask about drums. Yes, you can sample drums in the EXS24, but honestly, it's probably more intuitive to work with drums in the Ultrabeat than it is with the EXS24. If you're looking to reproduce electronic drums, that is, if you're looking to create like hyper realistic acoustic drums, then the EXS24 is actually the way to go, and we'll do a video or two on that as well. So, and I should also bring up that this EXS24 video is going to be this is a multi-part video. The EXS24 is one of the deepest, most powerful instruments that comes with Logic, and a lot of people just don't know how to use it properly, so they kind of just use its presets, and that's pretty much it. But when it comes down to it, it's a very, very deep instrument, and it takes a long time to learn everything that it does. So this will probably end up being a 4-part series just for this one instrument alone. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.